Have you ever met someone who seems impossibly calm, impossibly kind, impossibly pure, so certain that they could never do harm? And have you ever wondered what lies beneath that certainty? Jung believed that what makes a person dangerous is not the darkness inside them, but the part they refuse to see. Tonight, we're going to look at what happens when the mask of goodness grows too perfect, and what the silence behind it might be trying to say. Chapter 1. The dangerous question. What is the most dangerous sign in a person? When most of us hear this question, our mind immediately begins to search for clear and visible signals, the kinds of behaviors that are obvious to anyone who is watching. We think about physical violence, or uncontrolled rage, or the cruel enjoyment of harming another person. We think about dishonesty, about manipulation, about patterns of behavior that make the people around someone feel unsafe. These answers are not wrong, but they remain at the level of symptoms. They are the eruptions we can already see, the consequences of something that has been growing beneath the surface for a very long time. If we stop at these visible acts, we never reach the root of the problem. We never discover what makes such eruptions possible in the first place. The real danger lies much deeper, hidden in the parts of the human mind that are rarely examined. The places where people hide things not only from others, but from themselves. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, and one of the most influential thinkers in psychology, spent his career studying exactly these hidden places. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Jung did not confine his attention only to the conscious mind, the surface of thought where words and reasoning live. He was fascinated by what lies underneath consciousness, the vast and often invisible territory of instincts, impulses, and desires that continue to shape human behavior, whether we acknowledge them or not. He gave this territory a name that has now become central to psychology. He called it the shadow. The shadow is not a poetic metaphor, but a very precise description of all the parts of ourselves that we do not want to see. These can include traits that feel dark, like anger or envy or cruelty, but also traits that are neutral or even positive, such as creativity, assertiveness, or the desire for recognition, which have been pushed away because of upbringing, cultural pressure, or fear of rejection. Whatever is placed in the shadow does not vanish simply because it is denied. It waits, it gathers force, and it eventually begins to influence behavior in indirect and often destructive ways. To understand why Jung regarded the denial of the shadow as so dangerous, imagine a person who insists, with complete conviction, that they are never jealous. They see jealousy as an ugly weakness, something they cannot possibly experience. Yet the feeling does not disappear. It slips into their behavior in disguised forms. They belittle the achievements of others. They spread subtle criticisms. They withdraw affection or approval in ways that feel punishing. To the outside world, the pattern is visible, but to the person themselves, it is invisible, because the jealousy has been denied. Another example is the person who proudly declares that they never lie. To them, lying is immoral, and they are above it. Yet when we listen closely, we find half-truths, carefully chosen omissions, and manipulations of language that bend reality in their favor. They do not see these distortions as lies, because the identity of "I am always honest" has become too important to give up. In both of these cases, what makes the person dangerous is not the presence of jealousy or dishonesty, which are ordinary human traits, but the refusal to acknowledge them. The denial itself is the danger. This process of denial and disguise is what Jung called projection. Projection happens when the traits we cannot accept in ourselves are pushed outward and cast onto the people around us. The angry person insists that everyone else is hostile. The selfish person complains constantly about the selfishness of others. The dishonest person accuses others of manipulation. Projection is not a deliberate act of deception. It is an unconscious process, and that is why it is so powerful. Because the person does not see what they are doing, they cannot stop, and because they cannot stop, The people around them become confused, destabilized, and sometimes deeply harmed. The shadow has found a way to act, even while remaining hidden. When we look at danger in this way, it becomes clear that the most dangerous sign in a person is not loud or obvious. It is not the raised voice, the slammed door, or the dramatic act of cruelty. Those are already too visible to qualify as the most dangerous sign. The most dangerous sign is the inability to reflect, the inability to recognize flaws, the inability to admit that there are darker parts inside. A person who cannot see their own shadow becomes unpredictable and uncontrollable, not only to others, but also to themselves. They live under the illusion that they are harmless, while the denied traits direct their behavior from the background. It is important to remember that Jung did not describe the shadow as purely evil. He argued that the shadow is made of everything that has not yet been integrated into conscious awareness. Some of these things are destructive, but others are simply unlived potential. A child who was told that artistic expression was useless might bury their creativity in the shadow. A teenager who was shamed for being assertive might bury their ability to stand up for themselves. These buried traits do not vanish. They change form, and if they are never acknowledged, they can distort into something harmful. The repressed creativity might emerge as restlessness or resentment. The repressed assertiveness might emerge as controlling behavior. The danger comes not from the trait itself, but from its distortion through denial. The image Jung often used was simple. Imagine sweeping dirt under a rug. On the surface, the room appears spotless. Guests enter and compliment the cleanliness. But beneath the rug, the pile grows larger every day. One day, someone steps too hard, and the dirt bursts out in a cloud of dust that covers everything. That is what happens when the shadow is ignored. The denial does not erase the unwanted parts. It only delays them until they appear suddenly and overwhelmingly, often in ways that are far more destructive than if they had been admitted openly. This is why we must be cautious of people who present themselves as flawless. The colleague who insists they are always fair. The friend who claims they never get angry. The leader who declares they never make mistakes. At first, these claims sound admirable, but they carry within them a hidden warning. Human beings are never flawless. We all feel anger. We all make mistakes. We all carry impulses that are difficult to admit. The person who denies this completely has not become pure. They have become blind to their shadow. And in that blindness, the shadow gains more control than ever. So when we ask what is the most dangerous sign in a person, Jung's answer is that it is not the presence of darkness, because every person carries darkness within them. The most dangerous sign is the refusal to see it. The refusal to reflect, to admit, to integrate. The refusal to acknowledge imperfection. This refusal means that the shadow will continue to act invisibly, shaping thoughts, choices, and relationships, without the person ever realizing it. As Jung warned, until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives, and we will call it fate. This insight is not only a tool for recognizing danger in others, it is also a mirror for ourselves. Each of us has moments when we project, when we accuse others of what we secretly fear in ourselves, when we deny traits we do not want to own. Recognizing this does not make us bad, it makes us human. But pretending that it does not happen, pretending that we are above it, is what creates danger. Awareness reduces danger. Denial increases it. The most dangerous sign in a person is therefore not visible aggression or manipulation, though those are harmful. It is the deep and absolute denial of their own flaws. It is the belief that they are always good, always honest, always right, always pure. Because behind that belief, the shadow grows stronger. And when it acts, neither they nor the people around them will understand why. Chapter 2. Carl Jung's Lens. When we try to understand what makes human beings dangerous, it is tempting to stay at the level of behavior, to look at actions and judge them directly. Yet Carl Jung invites us to move deeper, to look beneath the surface into the foundations of the psyche where those behaviors originate. For Jung, danger was not just about external acts of violence or manipulation, but about the structures of the mind that give rise to them. His work was shaped by an attempt to understand how the conscious and unconscious parts of the human personality interact, and why what is denied within often returns in harmful ways without our awareness. Jung's psychology is vast and layered, but several key ideas allow us to build a clearer picture of why he placed such emphasis on the shadow. He believed that the human psyche is made up of multiple interacting systems: the conscious ego, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious. The ego is the seat of our identity, the part that says I am. It is what we usually mean when we say myself. The personal unconscious is the storehouse of memories, forgotten experiences, and repressed material unique to each of us. The collective unconscious goes deeper still, containing archetypes, universal symbols and patterns that are shared across humanity, and that shape how we understand ourselves, our roles, and our stories. The shadow sits in the personal unconscious, but is also tied to these universal archetypes. It is not random. It is structured by patterns that every human shares. And so while each person's shadow is unique, the way it operates follows recognizable laws. Jung believed that ignoring these laws and refusing to recognize the role of the shadow makes us vulnerable to repeating destructive cycles, both individually and collectively. This is why, when he looked at individuals, groups, or entire societies, he often returned to the same idea: what we deny in ourselves returns through projection, conflict, and violence. Consider Jung's time in early 20th century Europe. He watched the rise of collective movements that projected the shadow onto entire groups of people, creating division, hatred, and war. His writings during and after the World Wars emphasize how dangerous it is when a society refuses to acknowledge its own darkness. The same process that happens in the individual, denial, projection, blindness, happens in the collective. A society that insists it is pure inevitably projects its shadow onto an enemy, a scapegoat, a group that must carry all the qualities it refuses to see in itself. That is why Jung often insisted that what is not integrated within becomes destructive without. For the individual, this process begins early in life. Children are taught, often unconsciously, which parts of themselves are acceptable and which parts must be hidden. A child who expresses anger may be punished until they learn to bury their anger deep within. A child who seeks attention may be shamed until they silence that need entirely. A child who asserts independence may be called difficult until they suppress their strength. Each of these traits then sinks into the shadow. The child grows into an adult who believes that these qualities are absent from their character, when in fact they remain active in the unconscious. The adult may be convinced that they are calm, modest, and compliant, but in reality their buried anger, pride, and independence will emerge in disguised and distorted ways. The shadow, having been denied, begins to shape behavior from below. This is why Jung's lens is so useful for answering our question. When we ask what the most dangerous sign in a person might be, Jung points us to denial, to the refusal to face what lies in the shadow. Because in his framework, nothing denied actually disappears. It continues to act, but it acts from a place where it cannot be seen or controlled. The person believes themselves to be free of jealousy, or anger, or cruelty, while these very forces are quietly directing their behavior. The gap between self-image and shadow becomes the source of danger. Jung's concept of archetypes also deepens our understanding of this danger. Archetypes are recurring patterns of thought and behavior that appear across cultures. The hero, the mother, the wise old man, the trickster. Among these, the shadow itself is an archetype, the embodiment of everything that stands opposite to the persona, which is the mask we wear in society. The persona is the part of us designed to meet expectations, to fit in, to show a polished face to the world. The shadow is everything that the persona excludes. Together they form a pair, the bright mask and the dark underside. When someone identifies too strongly with the persona, believing only in the image they show to the world, they inevitably strengthen the shadow behind it. The brighter the mask, the darker the shadow. Think about someone who appears endlessly kind, agreeable to everyone, incapable of conflict. Their persona is one of harmony, but behind it may hide deep resentment, unexpressed needs, or even bursts of aggression that appear suddenly and without explanation. The stronger the identification with the image of kindness, the more the shadow builds, and the more dangerous its eventual eruption becomes. Jung's lens reveals that the danger is not in kindness itself, but in the denial of the darker impulses that accompany it. The same applies to those who present an image of perfect rationality, insisting that they are always objective, logical, and unemotional. Their persona is one of reason, but their shadow may contain unacknowledged emotions, biases, or impulses. Because these are denied, they can erupt suddenly in irrational decisions, bursts of anger, or prejudices that the person cannot see in themselves. The danger here lies in the gap between the mask and the hidden reality. The wider the gap, the greater the danger. Jung's work reminds us that the most dangerous sign in a person is not always what they display, but what they refuse to see. He wrote that people do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This statement is central to his lens. Enlightenment, safety, growth. All of these require turning toward the shadow, acknowledging it, and integrating it. The refusal to do so, the insistence that one is pure, flawless, or beyond human weakness, is what signals real danger. Because that denial guarantees that the shadow will act invisibly, distorting perception, shaping behavior, and often harming both the self and others. From Jung's perspective, then, we should not fear the person who admits to their flaws. Someone who says, "I struggle with envy," or "I know I can be harsh," is already safer because they are aware. The real danger lies with the person who says, "I never feel envy," or "I am always honest," or "I am never angry." Their denial is not proof of purity, but evidence of blindness. That blindness is the sign we should pay attention to. So when we ask what the most dangerous sign in a person might be, Jung's lens shows us that it is not found in outward behavior alone, but in the inner refusal to acknowledge the shadow. The sign is denial, absolute and uncompromising. That denial gives the shadow control, while the person continues to believe they are free of it. In this way, the unconscious directs their life, and they call it fate. Chapter 3. The Shadow Concept. When Jung spoke about the shadow, he was not speaking about some distant abstraction or a concept meant only for psychology textbooks. He was describing something that exists in every single one of us, something close and intimate, something that shapes our lives in ways we often do not realize. The shadow, as he defined it, is the sum of everything about ourselves that we cannot or will not acknowledge. It is made up of the parts of our personality that are incompatible with the image we want to show to the world, and sometimes even with the image we want to show to ourselves. It is what we push away into the darkness of the unconscious because it feels shameful, unacceptable, or simply too threatening to admit. The easiest way to understand the shadow is to think about the difference between who we believe we are and who we actually are. From an early age, we construct an identity, a story about ourselves that feels consistent. We tell ourselves we are kind, or fair, or disciplined, or creative, and we begin to polish these qualities into the persona we show to others. Yet no identity is complete, because to select one set of traits as me requires that we exclude others as not me. The excluded traits do not vanish. They are buried, repressed, pushed out of sight. Over time, they gather in the unconscious, and together they form the shadow. Imagine a child who is told that crying is a weakness. Each time tears come, the child is scolded or shamed. Slowly, the child learns not to cry, or at least not to cry where anyone can see. But the emotions that give rise to tears do not disappear. They are swallowed, hidden, stored in the shadow. Later, as an adult, this person may insist they never cry, that they are strong and unaffected. Yet inside they may feel storms of grief or sadness they cannot explain. The denial of tears becomes part of their identity, while the unacknowledged sadness becomes part of their shadow. Another child might be punished for speaking up, told repeatedly to stay quiet, to be polite, to never argue. Their assertiveness is buried, but it does not die. It grows in the shadow, waiting for moments to emerge, perhaps as bursts of anger or as manipulative control. This is the core of the shadow concept. Whatever we repress does not leave us. It stays with us, shaping our thoughts and behaviors from the background. Jung observed that the more strongly we deny something, the more influence it has. This is why the shadow is dangerous. A person who admits their flaws can work with them, manage them, soften them. But a person who denies them completely has no control, because the shadow operates unconsciously. They believe themselves free of envy or aggression, but those qualities direct their life from behind the scenes. The shadow is not limited to bad traits. It is better understood as everything that has been denied or left out of the conscious picture of the self. Many people bury their creativity because they were told it was impractical. Others bury ambition because they were told it was selfish. Some bury tenderness because they were told it made them weak. These disowned qualities also live in the shadow, and because they are denied, they can emerge in distorted ways. The lost creativity may return as frustration or jealousy of others. The buried ambition may resurface as bitterness. The suppressed tenderness may come out as sudden, confusing neediness. Jung believed that this process of shadow formation is universal. No one escapes it, because no one can live a life where every aspect of their being is openly expressed and accepted. Families, cultures, religions, and societies all impose rules and expectations. Some of these rules are necessary for social life, but they always come with a cost. They force parts of us underground. The shadow, then, is the price of civilization. We learn to wear masks that help us belong, but behind those masks, the excluded parts remain alive. The more rigid the mask, the stronger the shadow becomes. Jung called the mask the persona, the face we present to the world. The persona is useful and necessary. Without it, we would struggle to adapt to the demands of life. But when the persona becomes too polished, too rigid, it creates an equally rigid shadow. For example, a person who prides themselves on being endlessly generous may push every trace of selfishness into the shadow. A person who insists on being always rational may repress all emotion. A person who strives to be perfectly moral may deny every hint of desire or instinct. In each case, the brighter the mask, the darker the shadow that forms behind it. What makes the shadow so powerful is that it does not simply stay hidden. It pushes toward expression. It shows up in dreams, in slips of the tongue, in sudden reactions we do not understand. It erupts in moments of stress, when the conscious control weakens. It appears in projections, when we accuse others of the very things we cannot face in ourselves. Jung often said that what we dislike most strongly in others is often a clue to what we have not accepted in ourselves. That is the shadow at work. Think of a person who cannot stand arrogance. Everywhere they look, they see arrogance in others. They criticize colleagues, friends, even strangers for being too full of themselves. But if they look inward, they may find that they too have pride, ambition, or a desire for recognition that they cannot admit. Instead of owning it, they project it outward. They live in a world filled with arrogant people, never realizing that what disturbs them is also inside. The shadow distorts perception in this way, shaping not only our actions but the way we see the world. For Jung, the existence of the shadow was not optional. It was a fact of human life. The only question is whether we acknowledge it. To acknowledge it does not mean to indulge it or to act out every impulse. It means to admit that it is there, to recognize that we are not as pure, as flawless, or as simple as we wish to believe. Denying the shadow makes it stronger. Facing it, however uncomfortable, gives us the possibility of integration. This is why the shadow concept is so central to answering our question about dangerous signs in a person. The presence of anger, envy, or selfishness is not dangerous by itself. These are human qualities. What makes them dangerous is denial, because denial gives the shadow control. A person who says, "I can be angry," has a chance of managing their anger. A person who insists, "I am never angry," is ruled by anger without knowing it. The shadow directs them, but they remain blind. Jung warned that until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives, and we will call it fate. That is the essence of the shadow concept. What we hide becomes what rules us. What we deny becomes what acts through us. And what we refuse to see in ourselves becomes what we project onto the people around us. The most dangerous sign in a person, then, is not their darkness itself, but their refusal to acknowledge it. Chapter 4. The Birth of the Shadow. The shadow is not something that appears suddenly in adulthood, nor is it a mysterious force that arrives from outside. Rather, it is something that begins to form in the earliest years of life, built slowly out of experiences, lessons, rewards, and punishments, until each of us carries within us a collection of unacknowledged parts that continue to shape who we are, even when we no longer remember how they were first created. The birth of the shadow begins with the moment we are taught that some parts of ourselves are acceptable and others are not, that some feelings are safe to express while others will bring rejection, that some desires will earn love while others will bring shame. A child comes into the world with a full range of impulses: joy, curiosity, anger, jealousy, tenderness, fear, and aggression. In the beginning, these impulses flow freely, unfiltered, expressed without calculation. But very quickly the child begins to learn which ones are welcomed and which ones are rejected. When a small child shows anger by crying or shouting, perhaps the parent soothes them gently, teaching them that their emotions can be expressed safely. But perhaps the parent scolds them, calling them bad, insisting that anger is unacceptable. And so the child learns to push the anger down, hiding it not only from others, but eventually from themselves. When a child seeks attention, they may be embraced and celebrated, or they may be told to stop being selfish, to stop showing off, to stay quiet. And if that message repeats often enough, the desire for attention becomes a source of shame, and it is pushed out of sight into the shadow. The process is not always cruel or deliberate. Parents, teachers, and communities believe they are guiding children towards social life, teaching them to fit into groups, to behave according to rules that allow harmony. And in many ways this is true, because without limits society cannot function. Yet every act of guidance also creates division within the self. What is accepted becomes part of the conscious identity, the persona, the mask of who I am. What is rejected becomes part of the unconscious, the shadow, the hidden collection of who I am, not allowed to be. The shadow is born not in dramatic moments, but in thousands of small corrections, instructions, and shames, until the child grows into an adult who believes sincerely that certain traits are absent from their nature, when in reality, those traits remain alive in the darkness of the unconscious. Consider a girl who grows up in a family where obedience is praised and questioning is punished. Each time she asks why, she is told to stay quiet, to respect authority, to stop being difficult. Eventually she learns that curiosity and independence are dangerous, that to be loved she must be compliant, agreeable, silent. As she grows older, her persona becomes one of politeness and obedience, but within her shadow live all the unexpressed questions, all the unclaimed strength, all the suppressed anger of being silenced. In adulthood, she may find herself erupting in bursts of defiance that surprise even her, or she may project her buried independence onto others, seeing them as rebellious, disruptive, or threatening. She does not know that what disturbs her is the very part of herself that was denied long ago. Or consider a boy who grows up in a culture where tenderness is ridiculed. Each time he cries, he is mocked, told to be strong, told that real men do not cry. He learns quickly to bury his sadness and even his compassion, replacing them with toughness, humor, or indifference. On the surface, he may become confident, seemingly unshakable, but beneath that surface lies a shadow filled with vulnerability, longing, and fear. Because he cannot admit these parts of himself, they may emerge instead as irritability, coldness, or even cruelty. What was once a natural impulse for connection becomes distorted through repression, and the shadow, born in childhood, shapes the adult in ways that are often confusing and painful. Jung emphasized that this process is universal, because every society has rules and expectations that force certain traits underground. No culture permits everything. Each one has its own version of what is acceptable, and so every child learns to hide some part of themselves. The result is that every adult carries a shadow, whether they admit it or not. The differences lie only in which traits are buried and how strongly they are denied. For some, the shadow may contain anger. For others, sexuality. For others, ambition, greed, tenderness, or pride. What unites them all is that the shadow is formed out of what was once conscious and alive, but became unacceptable and was pushed away. The danger of this process lies in the illusion it creates. The adult grows up believing that they simply are not angry, or not jealous, or not selfish, when in reality, those traits are simply hidden. The stronger the denial, the less the person understands their own behavior, because the shadow finds ways to emerge whether they want it to or not. It may appear in dreams, in sudden outbursts, in projections onto others, or in self-sabotage. The person is left confused by their own actions, unable to explain why they act in ways that contradict their conscious identity. What makes the birth of the shadow so significant is that it sets up a lifelong tension between the persona and the unconscious. The persona says, "I am kind, I am fair, I am disciplined, I am generous." The shadow contains all the opposite qualities that have been denied: the selfishness, the laziness, the cruelty, the anger. The more tightly someone clings to their persona, the more strongly their shadow grows behind it. This is why Jung often warned that people who seem too good, too flawless, too polished, are often the ones carrying the heaviest shadows. Their perfection is not a sign of purity, but of repression, and repression always seeks release. This is the origin of many of the most dangerous patterns we see in people. A leader who insists they are always moral may secretly indulge in corruption. A partner who insists they are never jealous may become controlling and suspicious. A colleague who insists they are always calm may suddenly explode in rage. In each case, the shadow that was born in childhood and strengthened over years of denial finally pushes into the open, often in destructive forms. Understanding the birth of the shadow allows us to see why denial is the most dangerous sign in a person. It is not the presence of anger or envy or selfishness that makes someone dangerous. These are human qualities shared by all of us, but the refusal to admit them, the refusal to integrate them into a fuller picture of the self. When someone cannot admit that they have a shadow, the shadow controls them completely. They project it onto others, accuse others of what they cannot accept in themselves, and remain blind to the ways their unconscious is directing their life. Chapter 5. Not evil, just denied. When we speak of the shadow, it is tempting to think of it only as the dark side of human nature, a place where cruelty, selfishness, greed, and violence are stored. But Carl Jung insisted that this picture is incomplete and even misleading, because the shadow is not purely evil. It is simply everything that has been denied. everything that has been excluded from the conscious picture of who we think we are. And while that includes destructive traits, it also includes neutral qualities, and sometimes even qualities that could be deeply positive if they were allowed to exist openly. The shadow is therefore not a monster that must be destroyed, but a collection of neglected parts of the self, waiting for recognition, and it becomes dangerous, not because of its content alone, but because of the way it is hidden and denied. Think of a child who is naturally assertive, who asks questions, challenges rules, and speaks their mind without fear. If this child grows up in a family or a culture where obedience is prized above all, where questions are treated as disrespect, and where speaking up is punished, then the child will quickly learn to bury their assertiveness. To survive, they will adopt compliance as part of their conscious identity. They may grow into an adult who thinks of themselves as polite, agreeable, even submissive, but deep in their shadow lies the assertiveness that was denied. This buried quality is not evil, but because it has been forced underground, it can appear in distorted forms, perhaps as sudden explosions of anger, perhaps as manipulation, perhaps as resentment that poisons relationships. Another example is creativity. A child who loves to draw, to invent stories, to experiment with ideas may be told that such activities are a waste of time, that they must focus on practical matters, that art and imagination will never put food on the table. Over time, this child may learn to deny their creativity, replacing it with diligence, seriousness, or conformity. As an adult, they may insist they are not creative at all, that they are rational and practical. But in their shadow, the suppressed creativity still lives. Because it cannot be expressed openly, it may come out sideways, perhaps as envy of others who create, perhaps as bitterness, perhaps as restless dissatisfaction with life. Again, there is nothing evil in creativity itself, but when denied, it becomes a source of danger both to the individual and to those around them. Jung wanted us to understand that the shadow is not a dungeon full only of monsters. It is also a vault filled with neglected treasures. Yet when these treasures are locked away and forgotten, they do not stay harmless. What is denied becomes twisted, and what is unlived becomes a source of pain. A person who denies their sexuality may become rigid, judgmental, or hypocritical. A person who denies their need for love may become cold, detached, or controlling. A person who denies their ambition may undermine others or sabotage success. In every case, the quality itself is not evil, but the denial of it gives rise to destructive outcomes. This is why Jung described the shadow as morally neutral. It contains both what is dark and what is light, both destructive impulses and creative potentials. The problem lies in repression. When something is pushed away, it loses the possibility of being integrated into a balanced whole. Instead, it acts from the darkness, where it is less visible and therefore less controllable. In this way, even qualities that could enrich life become sources of harm if they are denied. To see this clearly, we must let go of the habit of dividing the self into good and bad, because this division itself is what gives birth to the shadow. We prefer to believe that everything good lives in the light of consciousness, and everything bad lives in the darkness of the unconscious. But the truth is far more complex. Many so-called good traits, when exaggerated or performed for the sake of a persona, create shadows just as destructive as openly bad traits. Someone who clings desperately to an image of generosity may bury all awareness of their own needs, creating a shadow filled with selfishness and resentment. Someone who clings to an image of intelligence may bury their confusion or ignorance, creating a shadow filled with insecurity and arrogance. These qualities are not inherently evil. They are simply the other side of traits that society has demanded we display. The danger, then, is not in the shadow's contents, but in our refusal to acknowledge them. A person who says, "I am sometimes jealous," is safer than a person who insists, "I never feel jealousy." The first can work with their jealousy, admit it, even laugh at it, but the second is blind to it, and blindness makes it more powerful. A person who says, "I can be angry," is safer than a person who insists, "I never get angry," because the first can notice their anger and take responsibility, while the second will project it outward, accusing others of hostility, while never realizing that the hostility is their own. When Jung said that people do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious, this is what he meant. It is not enough to cultivate the qualities we believe are good. We must also look at the qualities we believe are bad, and even the qualities we believe are irrelevant or unimportant, because whatever is denied will return. Enlightenment does not come from ignoring the shadow. It comes from bringing the shadow into awareness, from admitting that we are more complicated, more flawed, and more complete than the simple persona we show to the world. This perspective also helps explain why certain people who seem flawless or virtuous can become the most dangerous. A leader who insists on their perfect morality may be hiding a shadow filled with corruption. A friend who insists on their endless kindness may be hiding a shadow filled with resentment. A partner who insists on their absolute honesty may be hiding a shadow filled with lies they cannot see. Their danger comes not from the qualities themselves, but from the denial that creates blindness. The more absolute the denial, the stronger the shadow becomes, and the more destructive its influence when it breaks through. It is worth pausing to notice that this description includes all of us. No one is free of the shadow, because no one can live a life without denial. Each of us has traits we cannot admit, impulses we push away, qualities we hide. This does not make us evil, it makes us human. The danger comes not from the presence of a shadow, but from the refusal to face it. To face it is difficult, because it means seeing in ourselves what we would rather only see in others. It means admitting we are not as simple or as pure as we wish. But only by admitting this can we begin to integrate the shadow, turning what is dangerous into what is manageable, and even turning what is denied into a source of strength. The shadow, then, is not evil, just denied. And in denial lies the danger. What is denied becomes distorted. What is distorted becomes harmful, and what is harmful creates suffering that might have been avoided. The most dangerous sign in a person is not that they carry darkness, but that they insist they do not. Chapter 6. Projection. The shadow escapes. The moment we deny a part of ourselves, it does not vanish into nothingness. It does not dissolve quietly, and it does not stop existing. Because the psyche does not allow erasure. Instead, the denied trait remains within us, alive but unseen, and it begins to search for another way to express itself. Carl Jung described this process with a term that has since become central to psychology: projection. Projection is the act of unconsciously relocating something that belongs to us and placing it onto another person, so that what we cannot face inside ourselves is suddenly visible in the outside world. In Jung's view, this is one of the most dangerous ways the shadow operates, because projection not only distorts how we see others, it also prevents us from ever recognizing the truth about ourselves. To understand projection, imagine that someone has spent their entire life denying their anger. As a child, they were punished for showing temper, so they buried it deep, convinced themselves that they are gentle, patient, incapable of rage. On the surface, they may appear calm, but inside the anger still exists, and because it cannot be admitted, it leaks outward. Everywhere they look, they begin to see hostility. A neutral comment from a colleague is interpreted as an attack. A simple disagreement from a friend is experienced as aggression. They are convinced the world is full of angry people, never realizing that it is their own buried anger that has been projected outward. The hostility they cannot see in themselves becomes the hostility they insist exists in others. Projection can happen with any denied trait. A person who cannot admit their own selfishness may constantly accuse others of being self-centered. A person who cannot face their dishonesty may live in suspicion, always certain that others are lying. A person who cannot acknowledge their desire for power may describe everyone around them as controlling or manipulative. In each case, The quality they cannot bear to own is pushed onto the external world so that they do not have to feel it as theirs. Jung warned that projection is dangerous because it makes the unconscious invisible to us. Once a trait is projected, we feel completely justified in our interpretation. We are certain that the other person really is jealous, or selfish, or cruel. We do not see that what we are describing is actually ourselves. This is why Jung called projection the most dangerous psychological mistake, because it blinds us to our own shadow while creating conflict with others. We fight against qualities in the outside world that are, in truth, our own denied qualities mirrored back at us. Think about how this plays out in relationships. In a marriage, one partner who is denied their own need for control may accuse the other of being domineering, while never realizing how controlling their own behavior has become. In a workplace, a manager who has buried their insecurity may see their employees as constantly questioning their authority, interpreting ordinary feedback as a threat. In friendships, someone who has denied their competitiveness may accuse others of rivalry, turning every interaction into a contest. These projections create tension, confusion, and mistrust, often destroying the very relationships that might have thrived if the shadow had been faced honestly. Projection also explains why people can sometimes become obsessed with certain flaws in others. When someone talks endlessly about how dishonest, arrogant, or selfish other people are, it is worth asking whether they are describing qualities they cannot face in themselves. The intensity of their criticism may not be about the other person at all, but about the shadow they have projected. Jung suggested that what we dislike most strongly in others is often a clue to what we have not yet accepted in ourselves. This is why our enemies can sometimes teach us more about ourselves than our friends. If we are willing to reflect, the danger of projection extends beyond individual relationships. Jung observed that entire societies can fall into projection, pushing their collective shadow onto an outside group. A nation that refuses to acknowledge its own aggression may label another nation as violent and dangerous, justifying war. A community that denies its own prejudices may accuse another community of being intolerant, while acting out intolerance in the process. History is filled with examples of groups projecting their shadow onto others, turning neighbors into enemies, scapegoating minorities, and fueling cycles of violence. What happens on the level of the individual also happens on the level of the collective, and the cost is magnified. What makes projection particularly insidious is that it feels real. When we project, we are not lying, we are not pretending, we are genuinely convinced. The shadow hides itself by disguising itself as external reality. This is why it is so difficult to break free from projection, because it requires us to question our own perception, to consider the possibility that what we see outside is in fact inside. Jung insisted that the work of individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires us to withdraw our projections, to reclaim the traits we have pushed onto others, and to admit that they belong to us. Reclaiming projections is painful. It means admitting that the selfishness we despise in others is also in us. It means acknowledging that the dishonesty we condemn is something we are capable of too. It means seeing that the aggression, envy, arrogance, or fear we fear most in the world is also part of our own shadow. Yet this is the path to growth, because once we reclaim these traits, they no longer control us from the unconscious. We can work with them, balance them, and even find positive expressions of them. The selfishness we admit may become healthy self-care. The aggression we accept may become strength and determination. The envy we acknowledge may point us toward unfulfilled desires that we can pursue constructively. Jung did not believe that projection could be eliminated entirely. He saw it as a natural mechanism of the psyche, something that happens whenever we are confronted with traits we have not yet integrated. But he did believe that we can learn to recognize it, to pause when we feel intense judgment of others, and to ask ourselves whether we are seeing something of our own shadow. This is the work of making the unconscious conscious. It requires humility, patience, and honesty. But without it, we remain trapped in cycles of projection, forever blind to the truth about ourselves. So when we ask what the most dangerous sign in a person might be, projection must be high on the list. Not projection in the sense of occasional mistakes and judgment, but projection as a way of life. Projection that is absolute and unquestioned. Projection that convinces someone they are flawless while filling their world with enemies, rivals, and threats. Such a person is not aware of their shadow at all, and because they cannot see it, they project it endlessly. They become a danger to themselves, to those around them, and even to entire communities, because their blindness distorts every relationship and every decision. The shadow will always find a way to escape denial, and projection is its favorite path. The more we deny, the more we project, and the more dangerous we become. Jung's lesson is clear: until we are willing to look inward, to recognize the traits we push away, we will continue to see them outside, fighting shadows we believe belong to others, never realizing that they have always been our own.
Chapter 7.
The illusion of innocence. One of the most subtle and therefore most dangerous effects of the shadow is the creation of an illusion of innocence, a mask that allows a person to appear harmless, kind, or pure, while concealing the darker impulses that continue to live within them. Jung was careful to point out that the shadow thrives most when it is denied, and the strongest denial often takes the form of absolute claims of virtue. The insistence that one is incapable of anger, that one never lies, that one always acts for the good of others. Such claims do not reflect reality, because no human being is entirely free of these traits, but they reflect the power of the persona, the mask of identity that we wear in order to survive in society. When the mask becomes too polished, when it insists too loudly on innocence, the shadow behind it grows darker, more distorted, and ultimately more dangerous. The illusion of innocence is persuasive precisely because it feels good to believe in it. We are naturally drawn to people who present themselves as kind, honest, or unselfish, and we often prefer to ignore the possibility that such images might be hiding something deeper. It is uncomfortable to question goodness, so we accept it at face value. Yet Jung warned that whenever someone insists too strongly on their purity, we should pause, not because they are lying deliberately, but because their shadow may have been buried so thoroughly that they are blind to it themselves. The greater the insistence on innocence, the more powerful the shadow that has been repressed. Consider the person who insists that they are never angry. They present themselves as calm, even-tempered, endlessly patient. To those around them, they appear almost saintly in their tolerance. Yet in reality, no human being is free from anger. It is a natural response to frustration, to injustice, to betrayal. When such a person denies anger completely, it does not vanish. It collects in the shadow. Over time, it may erupt in ways that are difficult to recognize as anger, perhaps in passive-aggressive silence, perhaps in sudden bursts of cruelty that seem out of character, perhaps in bitterness that poisons relationships. Because the person cannot admit to anger, they cannot recognize these behaviors for what they are. And so the illusion of innocence makes them even more dangerous, because they act out aggression while believing they are incapable of it. Another example is the person who insists that they are always honest. On the surface, such a person may appear admirable, trustworthy, reliable, but honesty is rarely absolute. Everyone tells small lies, even if only to spare feelings, to smooth social interactions, to avoid unnecessary conflict. To deny this is to deny an essential part of being human. The person who insists on their perfect honesty is likely to engage in distortions they cannot recognize, perhaps by omitting inconvenient details, by reframing stories to protect themselves, or by convincing themselves that manipulation is simply clarity. To others, these behaviors may look deceptive, but to the person themselves, the illusion of honesty remains intact. Again, the shadow escapes in distorted form, and the illusion of innocence makes it more dangerous. The illusion of innocence can also appear in collective forms. A community may describe itself as moral, pure, or chosen, insisting that all corruption, greed, or cruelty exists only outside its borders. Within, members believe in their virtue, but the shadow of the community remains active. It may appear as intolerance, prejudice, or exploitation, all the while cloaked in the language of righteousness. The more strongly the community insists on its innocence, the less capable it is of seeing its shadow, and the more harm it inflicts without recognizing it. History is filled with examples of groups that destroyed others in the name of their own purity, convinced of their innocence while enacting cruelty. What makes the illusion of innocence so convincing is that it is rarely a deliberate lie. People who deny their flaws are not usually deceiving others, they are deceiving themselves. They genuinely believe they are free from anger, envy, or dishonesty, because these qualities have been buried in the unconscious for so long that they are invisible. This is what makes the illusion dangerous. A person who lies about their anger knows, at some level, that they are angry, and they may still take responsibility. But a person who has denied anger completely cannot take responsibility, because they do not see it at all. They will insist they are innocent, even as they harm others, and this blindness makes them unpredictable and uncontrollable. Jung described this as one of the central dangers of the human psyche, the belief in one's own innocence. For him, true safety lay not in innocence, but in awareness. To know that we have a shadow is safer than to deny it. To admit that we are capable of anger, envy, or deceit is safer than to insist that we are not. Because once we admit these qualities, we can manage them, balance them, and prevent them from acting unconsciously. But once we deny them, they act without restraint, hidden from view, escaping in projections, distortions, and destructive behavior. The illusion of innocence also prevents growth. If I insist that I am always honest, I will never see the small ways in which I distort truth, and so I will never improve. If I insist that I am never angry, I will never learn how to express anger constructively, and so my anger will continue to leak out destructively. If I insist that I am always unselfish, I will never learn how to care for my own needs, and so my generosity will eventually sour into resentment. Innocence, in this sense, is not virtue but stagnation, a refusal to see the full truth of who I am. In relationships, the illusion of innocence can be devastating. A partner who believes they are incapable of harm may dismiss the pain they cause, insisting that the problem lies only with the other person. A friend who believes they are endlessly loyal may betray without realizing it, unable to see their own shifting motives. A leader who believes they are always fair may enforce policies that are cruel, blind to the suffering they create. The illusion protects the self-image, but damages everyone else. This is why Jung insisted that true morality is impossible without shadow work. To be moral is not to insist on innocence, but to face the reality of one's own darkness, to admit that we are capable of the very flaws we condemn, and to work consciously to limit their expression. Innocence is an illusion, but awareness is strength. So when we ask what the most dangerous sign in a person might be, we must consider this illusion of innocence. It is the person who insists too loudly on their purity, the person who believes too completely in their perfection, the person who cannot see their flaws at all, not because they are secretly plotting harm, but because their shadow acts without their knowledge, and because their blindness makes them incapable of responsibility. They are not evil in their intention, but they are dangerous in their denial. Chapter 8. Repetition and Denial. When Jung described the shadow, he emphasized that its influence is not a single event that happens once and then disappears, but rather a pattern that repeats itself again and again. Because what we deny does not vanish, and what we refuse to see in ourselves continues to act from the unconscious in cycles that return until they are finally recognized. This is why so many people find themselves caught in recurring situations, repeating the same conflicts in relationships, the same mistakes in work, the same destructive choices in life. Because the shadow, when denied, pushes us toward repetition, as if it is demanding to be seen, as if it is insisting that we pay attention. Imagine someone who has buried their jealousy deep in the unconscious, convinced that they are above envy, that they are too noble to compare themselves with others. On the surface, they may even appear generous, praising the success of friends, celebrating the achievements of colleagues, smiling politely at good news. But inside, the jealousy continues, and because it cannot be admitted, it leaks out in subtle criticisms, in strained compliments, in small acts of sabotage. They do not recognize what they are doing, and so the cycle repeats. Each new success around them triggers the same hidden envy. Each new moment of comparison leads to the same shadow reaction, and because they refuse to face the jealousy itself, the pattern never changes. They live in a loop created by their own denial. The same process happens with anger. A person who insists that they are calm, that they never lose their temper, that they are incapable of rage, is often the one who erupts most violently when the pressure becomes too great. Because they have denied their anger, they have no practice in expressing it constructively, no awareness of its early signs, no tools for managing it. Instead, they repress it until it bursts out in sudden explosions that shock everyone, including themselves. And after the explosion, they return to denial, insisting that they are not truly angry, that the outburst was an exception, that it will never happen again. But of course it happens again, because the denial remains, and so the cycle continues, repeating endlessly, fueled by the shadow they will not see. Denial is what makes repetition possible. If we admit to our flaws, we can learn from them, change them, interrupt the cycle. But if we refuse to acknowledge them, we are condemned to repeat them, because the unconscious has no other way of teaching us. Jung believed that repetition is one of the psyche's ways of bringing the shadow to our attention. When the same conflict appears again and again, when we find ourselves saying, "Why does this always happen to me?" the answer is often that our shadow is asking to be seen. Life repeats the lesson until we are ready to face it. Repetition is not only personal, but also collective. Jung observed that societies, like individuals, deny their shadows, and in doing so they repeat their mistakes across generations. A nation that refuses to acknowledge its own aggression may repeatedly find itself at war. A culture that denies its greed may repeatedly create cycles of exploitation and collapse. A community that denies its prejudice may repeatedly persecute outsiders, convinced each time that it is acting in righteousness. Just as individuals project their shadows onto others, societies project their collective shadows onto enemies, scapegoats, or rival groups. And because the denial is never resolved, history repeats itself in endless cycles of conflict. The mechanism of denial is deceptively simple. It begins with discomfort. We feel a trait or an impulse that we do not like, something that threatens our self-image. Instead of admitting it, we push it away, telling ourselves that it does not belong to us. For a moment, this feels successful. The discomfort fades, and we can continue believing in our innocence. But the denied trait does not disappear. It remains active in the unconscious, influencing us from below. Because we do not see it, we cannot control it. And because we cannot control it, it acts in ways that surprise us. Afterward, we explain it away. We rationalize, we return to denial. And so the cycle begins again, creating a repetition that will continue as long as the denial continues. Consider the person who repeatedly chooses partners who treat them poorly. They tell themselves that they are unlucky, that others are always the problem, that they simply have bad fortune in love. But Jung would suggest that something in their shadow is shaping these choices. Perhaps a denied sense of unworthiness. Perhaps a hidden belief that they do not deserve respect. Perhaps a fear of intimacy that sabotages healthier connections. Because they deny these inner forces, they cannot change them. And so the pattern repeats, each relationship echoing the last. Only by facing the denied part of themselves can the repetition be broken. Or think about the leader who repeatedly falls into scandal. Each time they are caught, they deny responsibility, insist that they were misunderstood, claim that the problem lies elsewhere. They never admit the shadow traits, greed, arrogance, dishonesty, that drive their actions. As a result, each scandal looks like the first. Each mistake is repeated, and the cycle never ends. The denial ensures that nothing is learned, and the shadow ensures that the pattern continues. Jung believed that repetition is not punishment, but opportunity. Each repeated conflict is another chance to see what has been denied, another invitation to bring the shadow into the light. But most people do not take this opportunity, because denial is easier than reflection. To admit a flaw threatens the persona, the mask of identity we work so hard to maintain. It feels safer to blame others, to insist on innocence, to cling to the illusion that the problem is outside. But in doing so, we guarantee that the cycle will continue, because the shadow has not been faced. This is why repetition is one of the clearest signs of denial. If we find ourselves in the same argument again and again, if we make the same mistake despite our best intentions, if life seems to keep giving us the same lesson, it is worth asking whether we are dealing with our shadow. Perhaps the repetition is not an accident. Perhaps it is a signal that something within us is being denied. The most dangerous sign in a person is not simply that they make mistakes or that they have flaws. Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone has flaws. The most dangerous sign is when they refuse to see the repetition, when they deny the pattern, when they insist that the problem is always outside themselves. Because in that denial, they guarantee that the shadow will continue to act, that the cycle will continue to repeat, that harm will continue to spread without awareness or responsibility. For Jung, the only way to end the cycle is through awareness, to see the pattern, to admit the shadow, to make the unconscious conscious. Until then, repetition is inevitable. Denial creates blindness, blindness creates repetition, and repetition deepens the danger. The shadow will not stop until it is seen. Chapter 9. The loss of self-awareness. If there is one sign that Jung considered to be at the heart of real danger, it is not anger, not envy, not even cruelty, but rather the gradual and sometimes complete loss of self-awareness. Because once a person can no longer reflect on their own behavior, once they can no longer admit that they might be wrong, once they can no longer recognize the shadow moving through them, they become capable of harm without even realizing it. Self-awareness is the fragile thread that keeps the conscious mind connected to the unconscious. And when that thread breaks, the shadow takes control, shaping actions and decisions in ways that feel natural to the person but appear destructive to everyone around them. The loss of self-awareness often begins subtly. A person convinces themselves that they know who they are, that their identity is fixed, that their story about themselves is the truth. They say, "I am a good person," and at first this claim is harmless, even necessary, because we all need a stable sense of identity. But when this identity becomes rigid, when it admits no contradiction, when it denies all evidence of imperfection, it becomes dangerous. The person no longer sees their own flaws because their self-image cannot allow them to. They begin to live entirely in the mask, the persona, while the shadow grows larger and darker behind it. Consider someone who has built their entire self-image around kindness. They believe they are generous, caring, compassionate, and indeed they may often act that way. But no one can be kind all the time, and inevitably there will be moments when frustration, irritation, or selfishness appear. If the person has enough self-awareness, they can notice these moments, laugh at them, and perhaps apologize. But if they have lost self-awareness, they will not see them at all. They will continue to insist that they are always kind, even as their actions grow more manipulative. Even as their resentment leaks out, even as their shadow twists kindness into control. Without self-awareness, they are blind to the damage they cause. Or take the example of a leader who prides themselves on fairness. They believe they are objective, rational, incapable of bias. This belief becomes central to their identity. But of course, like every human being, they have preferences, emotions, unconscious loyalties. When they make decisions that are unfair, their self-awareness should allow them to pause, to question themselves, to admit that they might be wrong. But if they have lost that capacity, they cannot see the bias at all. They continue to insist that they are fair, while everyone else sees clearly that they are not. Their shadow, perhaps ambition, perhaps fear, perhaps pride, has taken over, but they remain convinced of their innocence. The loss of self-awareness is not simply blindness, it is a form of possession. Jung sometimes described the shadow as taking possession of a person when it is denied, because once self-awareness is gone, the shadow is free to act without resistance. The person becomes an instrument of their unconscious drives, speaking and acting with complete confidence, while being completely unaware of the forces guiding them. They do not question themselves, and because they do not question themselves, others find it difficult to question them too. Their conviction makes them persuasive, but their conviction is built on blindness, not truth. This is why Jung considered humility to be one of the most important psychological virtues. Humility does not mean weakness. It means maintaining the capacity to question oneself, to admit mistakes, to recognize that the shadow exists. Humility preserves self-awareness. Without it, the persona hardens into arrogance, and arrogance blinds. The most dangerous sign in a person is not that they feel anger or jealousy or pride, but that they feel these things without knowing it, that they act them out while believing they are free from them. When self-awareness is lost, projection increases. The person cannot see their own flaws, so they see them everywhere else. They describe others as selfish, aggressive, dishonest, or arrogant, never realizing that they are describing themselves. The shadow has taken control of perception. The world becomes a mirror, but they cannot recognize their reflection. They believe sincerely in their judgments, because to them they are real, but in truth they are fighting their own denied traits. This is what makes them so dangerous, their certainty. A liar who knows they lie can be challenged. A liar who believes they are always honest cannot. An angry person who admits their anger can seek help. An angry person who denies their anger will continue to explode without warning. The loss of self-awareness also prevents growth. If I can no longer see my flaws, I can no longer change them. If I cannot admit to my mistakes, I can only repeat them. If I deny my shadow, I can only be controlled by it. Without self-awareness, life becomes repetition, as the same conflicts and failures return again and again. Each time explained away, each time denied, each time blamed on others. The person remains trapped in their shadow, unable to step outside the cycle, because the very tool that would allow them to break it, self-awareness, has been lost. At the collective level, the same danger appears. A society that loses self-awareness becomes convinced of its own innocence. Even as it acts destructively, it insists on its goodness, its morality, its fairness, while projecting its shadow onto others. History shows again and again how nations have justified violence, oppression, and exploitation, while claiming to act in the name of justice. Without collective self-awareness, the shadow of the group takes over, and the result is cycles of conflict that devastate entire generations. Yet Jung also believed that self-awareness can be restored. The shadow cannot be erased, but it can be faced. When we notice our projections, when we question our judgments, when we admit the possibility that what we see outside may be inside, we begin to recover the thread of self-awareness. It is not easy, because it requires honesty, and honesty about the self is painful. It requires admitting qualities we have spent years denying, but it is the only path to integration, the only way to keep the shadow from taking complete control. So when we look for the most dangerous sign in a person, we should pay attention not to whether they feel anger or envy or selfishness, because all people do, but to whether they can recognize these traits in themselves. If they can, there is hope. If they cannot, if they insist too strongly on their innocence, if they cannot see the patterns of their own behavior, then the loss of self-awareness has already begun, and the shadow is already acting through them. That blindness, more than any single flaw, is the true danger, because it leaves them unable to learn, unable to change, and unable to stop the harm they cause. The shadow is always with us, but as long as we remain aware, we have a chance to balance it, to integrate it, to use its energy for growth rather than destruction. The moment we lose self-awareness, that chance disappears. We become instruments of what we deny, and we call it truth. We call it fate. We call it who we are. And in that state, we are at our most dangerous, not because of what we feel, but because of what we refuse to see. Chapter 10. Historical examples. When Jung spoke of the shadow, he did not mean only the hidden traits of individual people, but also the hidden traits of societies, cultures, and entire civilizations. Because just as individuals project their denied impulses onto others, so too do groups and nations project their collective shadows outward, creating patterns of conflict that repeat through history. To see how dangerous denial can become, we need only look at the stories of the past, where the illusion of innocence, the blindness of projection, and the loss of self-awareness have shaped events that devastated millions of lives. One of the most striking examples of the collective shadow appeared in the early 20th century, when nations across Europe, reeling from industrial change, economic crisis, and political upheaval, projected their fears and frustrations onto scapegoats. In Germany, the rise of fascism depended on this very mechanism. The national shadow, made up of humiliation after defeat in war, resentment at economic hardship, and fear of modernity, was denied at the level of the conscious self-image. Instead of admitting weakness or failure, the society projected these qualities outward, accusing outsiders, particularly Jewish communities, of embodying greed, corruption, and betrayal. The hatred was not born from the traits of the scapegoated group, but from the shadow of the nation itself. The denial of weakness created a mask of strength, and behind the mask, the shadow became genocidal. For Jung, who observed this period with growing alarm, this was not only politics but psychology on a massive scale. The refusal of a society to acknowledge its shadow made it dangerous beyond measure. This same pattern can be found in other parts of history. During the European witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries, communities that denied their own fears and desires projected them onto women who were accused of witchcraft. Villages that faced disease, crop failure, or unexplained misfortune could not accept these events as random or as part of their own shadow of helplessness, and so they projected the blame onto individuals who could serve as scapegoats. Women who were independent, outspoken, or simply unlucky became targets, accused of carrying the shadow qualities that the community could not face in itself. In reality, the witch hunts revealed not the guilt of the accused, but the denial of the accusers, who destroyed lives in order to maintain the illusion of innocence. The shadow also explains the cycles of colonialism, where powerful nations projected their own greed and violence onto the lands they invaded. Colonizers often described themselves as civilizers, bringers of light, carriers of progress, while accusing indigenous peoples of savagery, backwardness, or corruption. Yet the so-called savagery was more often a reflection of the colonizers' own brutality, their greed for resources, their willingness to exploit and destroy. The denial of this shadow allowed them to maintain the illusion that they were innocent benefactors, while their actions left scars that persist to this day. The collective shadow of empire, denied and projected, produced centuries of exploitation, justified as virtue. History is filled with these examples because denial and projection are not accidents, but constants of human psychology. Every society creates a persona, a mask of values and ideals that it claims to embody, and every society creates a shadow, made up of the traits it refuses to see. When the persona becomes too polished, when a culture insists that it is uniquely moral, uniquely rational, uniquely virtuous, The shadow grows darker, and when it is denied long enough, it erupts in violence, oppression, or destruction. Jung believed that the greatest threats to civilization were not external enemies, but internal shadows, denied until they took control. Even in more recent history, we can see how the loss of self-awareness produces cycles of harm. Consider the repeated financial crises of the modern world, where nations and institutions convince themselves of their stability, their fairness, their rationality, while burying the greed, recklessness, and fear that actually drive their decisions. Each crisis is explained as an exception, a mistake caused by others, while the same shadow behaviors repeat: speculation, exploitation, denial of responsibility. The pattern reveals itself, but without collective self-awareness, it continues. The shadow of economic life, denied and unacknowledged, shapes events that affect millions, while leaders insist that nothing could have been predicted. At the level of individuals in history, we see the same mechanism. Charismatic figures who insisted on their own virtue or destiny often revealed, through their actions, the shadow they could not see. Dictators who promised order and purity delivered violence and corruption. Leaders who claimed to be saviors projected their flaws outward, turning enemies into demons, convincing followers that the destruction of others was justified. The danger was not only in their ambition or cruelty, but in their complete blindness to their own shadows. They believed their illusions of innocence, and their certainty made them persuasive, even as their denial made them destructive. Yet history also shows us the opposite: individuals and movements that gain strength not by denying the shadow, but by acknowledging it. Jung admired leaders who admitted their flaws, societies that reflected on their mistakes, thinkers and artists who revealed the darkness within themselves as part of their work. When Abraham Lincoln admitted to his melancholy, he demonstrated a form of self-awareness that allowed him to lead with humility. When writers like Dostoevsky explored the darkest corners of human psychology, they showed how facing the shadow could create understanding rather than destruction. When South Africa, after apartheid, chose truth and reconciliation instead of denial, it demonstrated the power of collective shadow work, painful but necessary, to prevent endless cycles of projection and violence. These examples remind us that the shadow is not only dangerous, it can also be transformative if it is faced. For Jung, the lesson of history is clear. The most dangerous sign in a person is mirrored in the most dangerous sign in a society: the refusal to acknowledge the shadow. Whenever we see patterns of denial, whenever we hear claims of absolute innocence, whenever we encounter groups or individuals who describe themselves as flawless, we should recognize the warning. Danger lies not in imperfection, but in blindness. What is denied will return, and what is denied collectively will return collectively, with consequences far larger than any one person can control. History is a record not only of events, but of shadows. Shadows denied, shadows projected, shadows unleashed. If we wish to understand danger, we must look not only at what people and nations have done, but also at what they refuse to see in themselves. The witch hunts, the wars, the genocides, the empires, all were born from shadows denied and projected. The lesson is uncomfortable but essential. What is denied within us will not disappear. It will wait, it will grow, and when it escapes denial, it shapes history itself. Chapter 11. Everyday examples. It is easy to think of the shadow only in terms of history's great tragedies, or the destructive figures who altered the course of nations. Yet Jung reminded us that the same psychological patterns that lead to wars and persecutions also appear in the ordinary lives of individuals. The shadow is not confined to dictators, societies, or extraordinary circumstances. It is present in the daily interactions of families, friendships, workplaces, and communities. If we pay close attention, we can see how denial, projection, and the illusion of innocence shape the way people behave in the most familiar settings. and how the danger of the shadow lies not only in grand historical consequences, but in the small harms that accumulate quietly when people refuse to acknowledge who they really are. Consider the dynamic in a workplace where a manager prides themselves on fairness and objectivity. They believe deeply in their rationality, convinced that they treat everyone equally, that they never allow emotion or bias to cloud their judgment. This is their persona, the mask they present to themselves and to others. Yet within their shadow may live envy, favoritism, or insecurity, and because these qualities are denied, they inevitably leak into decisions. Perhaps they promote one employee repeatedly while justifying it as merit, when in truth it is favoritism. Perhaps they dismiss the concerns of another employee, insisting it is based on reason, when in reality it is rooted in irritation. The manager remains blind, insisting on their fairness, while everyone else sees the shadow at work. What makes this dangerous is not the presence of bias, which is human and universal, but the denial of it, because the denial prevents correction. Without self-awareness, the cycle repeats, and the harm spreads quietly through the workplace. Or think about a friendship where one person insists that they are always loyal, that betrayal is impossible for them. Their persona is built around trustworthiness, and they believe it sincerely. Yet loyalty is never absolute, because every person faces conflicting desires and competing responsibilities. If this friend feels neglected, or if new opportunities arise, or if they struggle with envy, their loyalty may falter. But because they cannot admit this possibility, the betrayal comes not as an honest conflict, but as a denial. They may talk behind the other's back while insisting they are loyal. They may withdraw support while describing themselves as steadfast. The shadow of disloyalty, denied and repressed, appears in disguised forms, creating confusion and pain. Family life offers countless examples. Imagine a parent who insists they are always patient. They believe themselves incapable of losing their temper, and so they ignore the irritation that builds slowly inside them. But the irritation does not vanish. It leaks out in sighs, in passive-aggressive comments, in sharp tones that wound more deeply because they are denied. The child feels the anger but is told it does not exist, creating confusion that may last a lifetime. Or consider a sibling who insists that they are never competitive. They say they are happy for their brother or sister's success, and perhaps they believe it, but in their shadow lives a desire to win, to outshine, to be recognized. Because they deny this, the competitiveness shows up in subtle sabotage, in jokes that cut, in celebrations that feel hollow. The family becomes a place where shadows interact, each denial creating patterns of tension that are difficult to name but impossible to ignore. Relationships between partners provide some of the clearest illustrations of the shadow at work. One partner may insist that they are never jealous, that they are above such feelings, that they are secure and trusting. Yet when their partner spends time with others, irritation grows. They begin to ask subtle questions, make veiled accusations, or withdraw affection. Because they cannot admit jealousy, they cannot name it, and because they cannot name it, they cannot manage it. The denial creates cycles of suspicion and conflict, not because jealousy itself is unusual, but because denial makes it uncontrollable. Another partner may insist that they are always honest, yet their shadow contains the small lies and omissions that smooth social life. Because they deny these, they engage in distortions without recognizing them, and when confronted, they insist that they are incapable of dishonesty. The result is confusion, because their partner sees the dishonesty clearly, while they remain blind to it. These everyday examples show that the shadow is not only a matter of morality, but also a matter of perception. Denial distorts how we see ourselves and others. The manager sees themselves as fair, while acting unfairly. The friend sees themselves as loyal while betraying. The parent sees themselves as patient while expressing irritation. The partner sees themselves as honest while deceiving. The denial creates a gap between reality and self-image, and in that gap the shadow acts. The danger lies in the blindness, in the inability to reflect, in the refusal to admit the flaw. Jung believed that one of the best ways to notice the shadow is to look at what irritates us most in others. If we find ourselves especially disturbed by arrogance, perhaps it is because we have not faced our own pride. If we are outraged by dishonesty, perhaps we have not admitted the ways we bend truth. If we are angered by selfishness, perhaps we deny our own needs. The intensity of our reaction is often a clue that we are looking not only at the other person, but also at our own projection. Everyday life is full of mirrors, but without awareness, we mistake those mirrors for enemies. The shadow also explains why small conflicts often escalate. Two people may argue, each convinced the other is at fault, each projecting their own denied traits. A colleague insists another is arrogant, while denying their own pride. A partner insists the other is dishonest, while denying their own distortions. The conflict becomes unresolvable, because neither side is aware of their own shadow. What could have been an honest conversation about flaws becomes a battle of projections, each person fighting qualities that belong to themselves. This is why Jung insisted that awareness of the shadow is essential, not only for personal growth, but for healthy relationships. Without it, every connection risks becoming a battlefield of denials. Even in communities, the shadow shapes everyday life. A group may pride itself on tolerance, while quietly excluding those who are different. A school may pride itself on fairness, while reinforcing hidden hierarchies. A workplace may celebrate teamwork, while rewarding competition. The persona of the group is polished and positive, but behind it lies the collective shadow, unacknowledged yet powerful. The denial prevents change because everyone believes in the mask, while the shadow continues to influence behavior. These ordinary patterns may not cause the dramatic devastation of war or genocide, but they cause suffering nonetheless. A child who grows up in a family shaped by denial may carry confusion into adulthood. A worker who struggles under an unfair manager may lose confidence. A friend who experiences betrayal disguised as loyalty may lose trust. A partner who faces jealousy denied may live in cycles of conflict. The shadow does not need history's stage to cause harm. It causes harm in kitchens, offices, classrooms, and bedrooms, wherever people refuse to face themselves. For Jung, the lesson is that danger is not distant, not confined to extraordinary figures or extraordinary times. The most dangerous sign in a person is visible in the ordinary moments when they refuse to admit their flaws. The refusal may look harmless, even admirable, because it is often expressed as virtue, patience, loyalty, honesty, kindness. But when these claims are absolute, when they admit no contradiction, they reveal denial, and denial reveals the shadow. The person may not intend harm, but their blindness makes harm inevitable. Everyday life is therefore the true testing ground of Jung's ideas. History may show us the consequences on a grand scale, but it is in the small moments that the shadow appears most often, and it is in those moments that we have the chance to notice it. The manager can pause and admit bias. The friend can acknowledge envy. The parent can confess impatience. The partner can accept jealousy. Each admission brings the shadow into awareness, and each act of awareness weakens its hold. The shadow remains, but it no longer controls. The danger is never in the flaw itself. The danger is in denial. And in everyday life, as much as in history, the refusal to see the shadow is the most dangerous sign of all. Chapter 12, Why It's Hard to See. Jung often reminded us that the shadow is not difficult to see because it is buried too deeply in the unconscious, but because it is so close, so familiar, and so uncomfortable that we resist acknowledging it. And in this resistance lies the real difficulty. What makes the shadow invisible is not its distance, but our refusal to accept that it belongs to us. Because to accept it would mean questioning the stories we tell about ourselves, stories that give us stability, comfort, and the illusion of innocence. The first reason the shadow is hard to see is that it threatens identity. Every person constructs a narrative about who they are, perhaps that they are kind or honest, or rational, or disciplined. These qualities become the mask, the persona that society rewards. But to maintain this image, we must exclude traits that do not fit. The person who believes they are kind must deny cruelty. The person who believes they are honest must deny dishonesty. The person who believes they are disciplined must deny laziness. These traits are pushed into the shadow, and because they contradict the identity we protect, we resist seeing them. To admit them would mean revising the narrative that holds us together. The second reason lies in social conditioning. From early childhood, we are praised for obedience, politeness, generosity, and diligence. We are scolded for anger, selfishness, jealousy, or defiance. These lessons shape us so deeply that we learn to bury what brings punishment and display what brings approval. As adults, the pattern continues. A leader hides fear to appear strong. A worker hides envy to appear professional. A parent hides impatience to appear caring. Society rewards the mask and discourages the truth, so the shadow remains denied, and denial feels safer than honesty. Another reason the shadow is difficult to see is that it disguises itself when it emerges. Repressed anger may appear as sarcasm or withdrawal rather than open rage. Repressed envy may show itself as criticism or cynicism rather than confession. Repressed fear may take the form of arrogance or bravado. Repressed tenderness may harden into rigidity. Because these disguises do not look like the original impulses, they are easy to rationalize, and we tell ourselves that we are only tired, or only being realistic, or only confident, while the shadow hides behind these masks. Projection deepens the blindness. What we cannot accept in ourselves, we see in others, and because projection feels like perception, it convinces us. If I cannot face my arrogance, I will accuse others of arrogance. If I cannot face my dishonesty, I will suspect dishonesty everywhere else. If I cannot face my selfishness, I will constantly describe others as self-centered. In truth, I am describing my own denied traits, but the world becomes a mirror I cannot recognize. This is why Jung said that what disturbs us most in others is often a clue to our shadow. Yet few of us are willing to look inward when judgment feels so certain. Denial also comforts the ego. To acknowledge the shadow means to feel guilt, shame, or fear. But to deny the shadow allows us to maintain the illusion of purity. The illusion may be false, but it is pleasant. The person who denies anger continues to believe they are patient. The person who denies envy continues to believe they are generous. The person who denies dishonesty continues to believe they are trustworthy. The illusion protects the self-image, even if it causes harm in relationships, because it feels easier to protect the mask than to face the discomfort. People cling to denial. What makes the shadow even harder to see is that it contains not only flaws, but also rejected strengths. Creativity, ambition, independence, sexuality, tenderness. Any of these can end up in the shadow if family or culture rejected them. But once they are hidden, they feel unsafe to reclaim. A person shamed for ambition may feel guilt when striving. A person mocked for tenderness may feel shame when showing vulnerability. A person dismissed for creativity may feel fear when trying to create. The shadow becomes not only a container for flaws, but also a vault of unlived potential. And because both danger and possibility are locked inside, opening it feels overwhelming. For all these reasons, the shadow remains hard to see. Identity clings to its mask. Society rewards denial. Disguises distort recognition. Projection misleads perception. Denial comforts the ego. And even buried gifts feel threatening to reclaim. Jung argued that this is why the shadow is so powerful, because what is denied acts unconsciously, shaping behavior invisibly. repeating patterns that feel inevitable, causing harm that seems fated. To see the shadow requires humility, patience, and honesty. It means admitting that we are not only what we claim, but also what we deny. It means looking at what we condemn in others and asking whether it belongs to us as well. It means accepting contradiction, admitting complexity, surrendering the illusion of innocence. The task is painful, but it is the only way to free ourselves from blindness, because until we see the shadow, it controls us. And until we admit it, the most dangerous sign in a person remains the refusal to see what has always been there. Chapter 13. The most dangerous sign defined throughout Jung's work on the shadow. There runs a single theme, a message repeated with careful insistence, that what makes people truly dangerous is not the fact that they have darkness within them, but the fact that they refuse to acknowledge it. The shadow itself is not unusual. Every human being carries it, and it is composed of the impulses, traits, and desires that we have learned to hide. The difference between someone who can live with balance and someone who causes destruction lies in whether they can admit the shadow is there. The most dangerous sign in a person, therefore, is not anger, not envy, not selfishness, but the refusal to recognize their own capacity for these traits. Denial is the sign that transforms ordinary human flaws into forces that operate blindly, and blindness is what makes them dangerous. To define this clearly, we can begin by contrasting two different kinds of people. One person says, "I know I can be impatient. I know I can be jealous. I know I sometimes exaggerate or distort." Another person says, "I am never impatient. I am never jealous. I am always honest." The first person may not be perfect, but they are safer, because their self-awareness allows them to notice their flaws, to take responsibility, and to correct themselves when necessary. The second person, by denying their flaws, has handed control to the shadow. Their impatience, jealousy, or dishonesty will still appear, but because they cannot see it, they cannot manage it. They will act destructively without realizing it, and because they believe in their innocence, they will feel justified in whatever they do. It is this conviction of innocence, supported by denial, that makes them most dangerous. Jung argued that the unconscious directs our lives until we make it conscious. If a person refuses to look at their shadow, the shadow continues to shape their behavior, their choices, their relationships, and even their perception of the world. They will project their flaws onto others, fight battles that belong to themselves, and repeat harmful patterns again and again. To those around them, the signs may be clear. They are defensive, accusatory, blind to contradiction, unwilling to reflect. But to themselves, everything seems natural. This lack of reflection is the dangerous sign, because it means they are ruled by impulses they cannot recognize. And nothing is more unpredictable than a person who does harm while believing they are incapable of it. It is important to notice that Jung did not describe the shadow as only negative. It contains destructive traits, yes, but also creative energies, instincts, and strengths that have been denied. What makes the shadow destructive is not its content, but its denial. When creativity is repressed, it may reappear as envy. When ambition is denied, it may return as bitterness. When tenderness is mocked, it may emerge as cruelty. These qualities themselves are not evil, but when denied they are twisted, and the twisting makes them harmful. The refusal to see them is what gives them their destructive power. In practical terms, the most dangerous sign in a person is absolute certainty in their own purity. It is the colleague who insists they are always fair while treating others with hidden bias. It is the friend who insists they are always loyal while undermining trust in subtle ways. It is the parent who insists they are always patient while wounding with irritation they refuse to admit. It is the leader who insists they are always honest while bending truth to suit their desires. None of these traits alone are fatal, but the refusal to admit them makes growth impossible. A person who believes they have no shadow cannot integrate it, and so the shadow acts in distorted and often destructive ways. This is why Jung emphasized humility as a safeguard. To be humble is not to think little of oneself, but to remain open to the possibility that we are flawed, that we can be mistaken, that we are not as innocent as we prefer to believe. Humility allows awareness, arrogance destroys it. When someone insists on perfection, they leave no space for reflection. When someone admits imperfection, they leave space for growth. The most dangerous sign is therefore not imperfection itself, but the arrogance of denial, the claim of absolute innocence. We can also define this danger by looking at relationships. In a partnership, the most harmful dynamic is not the presence of jealousy or anger, but the denial of them. The partner who can say, "I feel jealous," can talk, reflect, and work through it. The partner who insists, "I never feel jealous," cannot, and their jealousy appears in accusations, control, or withdrawal. The denial makes the emotion uncontrollable, and the uncontrollability makes it dangerous. In friendships, the same principle applies. A friend who admits envy can manage it, but a friend who denies it may sabotage unconsciously. In workplaces, a manager who admits bias can correct it, but a manager who denies it will perpetuate unfairness endlessly. In each case, the denial itself is the sign that danger is present. The same truth holds collectively. When societies insist on their innocence, when they claim they are uniquely moral, uniquely fair, uniquely enlightened, they are often hiding shadows of aggression, exploitation, or prejudice. History shows us the danger of these denials. Nations that proclaim their purity often enacted the greatest cruelties, because they projected their shadows onto enemies, scapegoats, or outsiders. A society that denies its flaws becomes blind to them, and blindness at that scale becomes catastrophic. The dangerous sign is always the refusal to reflect, the insistence on innocence. Jung's definition of the most dangerous sign, then, is not a list of traits, but a stance toward the self. It is denial. It is the person who cannot bear to admit the shadow, who insists on an image of purity, who refuses to question themselves. This stance is dangerous because it prevents awareness, and without awareness, the unconscious rules. The shadow becomes fate. It is worth noticing that the opposite of denial is not indulgence. Jung never suggested that we should act out every impulse, that we should embrace cruelty or dishonesty as virtues. Instead, he called for integration, the recognition that these impulses exist, that they are part of us, and that by admitting them we can manage them. To acknowledge jealousy does not mean to indulge it, but to own it, so it does not act unconsciously. To acknowledge anger does not mean to rage endlessly, but to use it constructively. To acknowledge selfishness does not mean to abandon generosity, but to balance it with self-care. Denial makes these qualities dangerous. Awareness makes them manageable. Defining the most dangerous sign in a person brings us back to Jung's most famous line: "Until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives, and we will call it fate." The most dangerous sign, then, is a life lived without this consciousness. It is the refusal to admit the shadow, the blindness that insists on innocence, the denial that leaves the unconscious in control. Every other danger, anger, envy, selfishness, cruelty, can be managed if admitted. None can be managed if denied. So when we look for the most dangerous sign in a person, it is not found in their flaws themselves, but in their refusal to see them. It is the lack of reflection, the absence of humility, the insistence on purity. This denial is what creates distortion, projection, repetition, and blindness. This denial is what turns ordinary human weakness into something unpredictable and destructive. And this denial is the sign that tells us, more clearly than any other, that the shadow is in control. Chapter 14. Jung's warning. When Jung reflected on the dangers of the human psyche, he often returned to a single sentence that captures the essence of his warning. Until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives, and we will call it fate. This statement, deceptively simple, contains within it the entire weight of his psychology, because it describes how denial of the shadow shapes not only the actions of individuals, but also the course of history. If we refuse to see what lies in the darkness of the psyche, those unseen forces will guide us, and we will believe that the outcomes are inevitable, when in truth, they are the consequences of our blindness. The warning is powerful because it emphasizes that danger does not come from the shadow itself, but from the refusal to recognize it. Every person has anger, envy, selfishness, fear, ambition, and pride. Every community has prejudice, aggression, and greed. These are not extraordinary flaws, but ordinary features of human life. The problem arises when individuals and societies deny them, when they insist that such qualities belong only to others, when they create illusions of innocence that leave them blind. Jung warned that the more strongly people cling to their masks of purity, the more powerfully the shadow acts beneath the surface, and the more harm it creates. Jung's words are a reminder that denial transforms weakness into destiny. An individual who cannot admit jealousy will sabotage relationships again and again, and afterward they will call it bad luck. A leader who cannot admit pride will make reckless choices, and afterward they will call it necessity. A society that cannot admit greed will exploit and collapse repeatedly, and afterward it will call it misfortune. The unconscious, unacknowledged, creates patterns that repeat endlessly, and because we refuse to admit their origin, we explain them away as fate. Jung's warning is that such fate is avoidable, but only if we are willing to face the shadow directly. What makes the warning urgent is that denial does not remain contained within the self. When the shadow is denied, it is projected outward. The individual who cannot face their dishonesty sees liars everywhere. The community that cannot face its aggression sees enemies on every border. The nation that cannot face its prejudice sees corruption only in outsiders. These projections justify action, sometimes violent action, because they feel real. The individual attacks others for traits they cannot face in themselves. The community persecutes those who mirror its shadow. The nation wages war in the name of defending its innocence. Jung saw clearly that the denial of the shadow is not a private matter. It becomes collective danger. At the same time, Jung's warning was not only about external conflict, but about inner suffering. He believed that much of what we call neurosis, anxiety, or depression comes from the refusal to acknowledge the shadow. When we deny essential parts of ourselves, whether flaws or potentials, we split the psyche, creating tension that cannot be resolved. The conscious mind clings to the persona, while the unconscious demands recognition, and the result is restlessness, confusion, or despair. Jung warned that this suffering would not end until the shadow was faced. The unconscious must be made conscious, not as a luxury but as a necessity for psychological health. To understand the full meaning of his warning, we can think of how denial operates in daily life. A person denies their anger, insists they are calm, yet their anger erupts in sarcasm, irritability, or cruelty. They harm others without realizing why, and afterward they insist they did nothing wrong. A parent denies impatience, yet wounds their children with coldness they cannot name. A partner denies jealousy, yet damages trust with suspicion they cannot acknowledge. Each denial becomes a pattern, and each pattern creates pain. The warning is that these patterns will not stop until awareness is restored, and if awareness never comes, the patterns will shape a life. On a larger scale, the same warning applies to societies. A community that denies its prejudice will enforce it unconsciously, while claiming to be fair. A nation that denies its aggression will project it outward, while claiming to defend peace. A culture that denies its greed will exploit others, while claiming to spread progress. The denial prevents reflection, and the absence of reflection makes harm inevitable. History becomes a record of shadows denied, and shadows denied become wars, persecutions, and collapses. Jung's warning was that what is not faced will return, again and again, until it is acknowledged. What makes this warning so important is that it is not a prediction of doom, but a call to responsibility. The unconscious will direct our lives until we make it conscious, but the possibility always exists that we can make it conscious. Awareness is possible, though it is difficult, because it requires humility. To admit the shadow means to accept that we are not as innocent as we believe. It means admitting that we are capable of the very traits we condemn. It means acknowledging that what disturbs us in others is often a reflection of ourselves. This honesty is painful, but Jung insisted it is the only path to freedom. Jung's warning also contains a paradox. The more we deny the shadow, the stronger it becomes. But the moment we admit it, its power begins to lessen. The person who says, "I know I am capable of envy," is safer than the person who insists, "I never feel envy." A leader who says, "I know I can be prideful," is safer than the leader who insists, "I am always humble." A society that says, "We have prejudices and must work to overcome them," is safer than the society that insists, "We are pure." The acknowledgement itself reduces danger because it restores awareness. The shadow is still present, but it is no longer ruling from the dark. This is the heart of Jung's warning, that the refusal to see the shadow guarantees danger, while the willingness to see it creates the possibility of growth. The unconscious will direct our lives until we make it conscious, and if we never make it conscious, we will call its influence fate. But fate is not fixed. Fate is often only the shadow in disguise. When we shine awareness into the darkness, we begin to reclaim what once controlled us, and what once seemed inevitable becomes changeable. So when we ask what the most dangerous sign in a person is, Jung's warning gives the answer with clarity. It is not the presence of flaws, but the absence of awareness. It is not anger, envy, or selfishness, but the denial of these traits, the insistence that they do not exist, the certainty of innocence. This denial is the sign that the unconscious is in control, and until it is faced, it will continue to shape a life, a relationship, a society, and even history itself. The warning is not only that danger exists, but that it can be lessened through awareness. The shadow cannot be erased, but it can be recognized, and recognition is what separates fate from freedom. Chapter 15. The Path to Integration. When Jung spoke of the shadow, he did not leave us only with warnings of its danger. He also insisted that there is a path forward, a way of working with this hidden part of ourselves, so that it does not control us from the darkness, but instead becomes integrated into the wholeness of who we are. This path is not easy, because it demands honesty, humility, and patience, but it is also not impossible. Jung called it individuation, the lifelong process of becoming whole, and he believed that no person could live fully until they confronted the shadow and gave it a rightful place in their conscious life. The first step on the path to integration is acknowledgement. This step may sound simple, but it is the hardest, because it requires us to admit that we are not only the persona we show to the world, but also the shadow we have hidden. To say aloud, "I am capable of anger, envy, selfishness, cruelty, fear," feels like a threat to the self-image we have built. Yet Jung insisted that acknowledgement is the doorway. Without it, the shadow remains unconscious, where it acts without our awareness. With acknowledgement, it begins to lose its power. A person who can say, "I know I feel jealous sometimes," has already taken the first step toward preventing jealousy from distorting their life. The second step is observation. Once the shadow is acknowledged, it must be watched carefully, not with judgment, but with curiosity. Jung believed that dreams, fantasies, slips of the tongue, and sudden emotional reactions all provide clues to the shadow. The work is to notice these moments and ask, what part of me is speaking here? What trait have I denied that is now appearing in disguise? Observation requires patience, because the shadow does not reveal itself all at once. It comes in fragments, through irritation, projection, or repetition. By observing, we begin to map its outlines, to recognize its voice, and to bring what was unconscious into the light of consciousness. The third step is acceptance. Acknowledgement and observation are not enough if they are followed by rejection. The shadow cannot be destroyed, only denied or accepted. You accept it means to admit that these traits are part of being human. I am not only generous, but also selfish. I am not only honest, but also capable of distortion. I am not only kind, but also cruel. Acceptance does not mean indulgence. It does not mean acting out every impulse. It means owning them as part of the whole. Jung believed that integration requires this moral courage. The courage to accept that we are more complex than the simple images we prefer. The fourth step is transformation. Once the shadow is accepted, its energy can be redirected. Anger, acknowledged, can become strength and determination. Envy, admitted, can reveal unfulfilled desires that point toward goals worth pursuing. Fear, faced, can become caution and wisdom. Selfishness, accepted, can become healthy self-care. Cruelty, recognized, can sharpen moral responsibility. The qualities of the shadow are not inherently destructive. They become destructive when denied. When integrated, they can provide balance and vitality. Jung saw the shadow not as an enemy to be eliminated, but as raw material for growth. On this path, humility is essential. Without humility, acknowledgement becomes impossible, because humility is the willingness to admit imperfection. Humility protects us from the illusion of innocence, from the arrogance of claiming purity. It allows us to say, I have a shadow, and it is part of me. Without humility, the mask hardens, denial deepens, and the shadow grows darker. Humility is therefore the foundation of integration. Relationships also play a role in this path. Jung believed that one of the clearest mirrors for the shadow is other people. What irritates us in others often points to what we deny in ourselves. To use relationships in this way requires courage, because it means asking, why does this person's arrogance disturb me so much? Is it because I cannot face my own pride? Why does this person's dishonesty enrage me? Is it because I cannot face my own distortions? Instead of simply blaming others, we can use these reflections to recognize our own projections. In this way, relationships become opportunities for shadow work, teaching us what we cannot see alone. The path to integration also requires compassion. Many people resist the shadow because they fear it will make them unworthy or unlovable. But Jung believed that facing the shadow actually makes us more human, not less. Compassion for the self allows us to see flaws without despair, to accept imperfection without shame. When we meet our shadow with compassion, we discover that it is not a monster but a neglected part of ourselves, waiting to be acknowledged. This compassion then extends to others, because once we see our own shadow, we can recognize that everyone else carries one too. This recognition softens judgment and allows deeper connection. Collectively, the path to integration is similar. Societies can admit their shadows, confess their flaws, and work to transform them. This requires truth-telling, reflection, and humility at a cultural level. Nations that admit their histories of violence can begin to heal. Communities that acknowledge prejudice can begin to change. Cultures that confess greed can work toward balance. Denial creates repetition, but acknowledgement opens the possibility of transformation. Jung's warning was that the shadow denied will rule us, but his hope was that the shadow faced can strengthen us. The path to integration is lifelong. The shadow never disappears. Here is part of being human. New traits will always be pushed into it. New projections will always appear. But each act of acknowledgement, each moment of awareness, weakens its control. The work is not to eliminate the shadow, but to live with it consciously. Jung described individuation as the process of becoming whole, and wholeness includes light and dark, persona and shadow. To integrate the shadow is to accept that wholeness is richer than purity, that balance is safer than denial, that humanity is more complex than innocence. So when we ask how to walk the path beyond danger, Jung's answer is clear. The shadow cannot be erased, but it can be faced. It cannot be denied without consequence, but it can be integrated with honesty. The most dangerous sign in a person is denial, but the most hopeful sign is acknowledgement. Awareness is the turning point. Once the unconscious is made conscious, fate becomes choice, and what once controlled us blindly becomes something we can carry with responsibility. The path is difficult, but it is the only path that allows us to live fully as ourselves. Chapter 16. Closing reflection. As we arrive at the end of this exploration, it is worth pausing to reflect on what Jung truly meant when he spoke of the shadow, and why he believed it held such importance for our lives. At the center of his psychology lies a paradox that many people resist. The darkness within us is not what makes us most dangerous. It is the refusal to recognize that the darkness exists at all. Every human being carries impulses, desires, and flaws that contradict the images they present to the world. This is not a sign of corruption, but of complexity. The problem begins when these contradictions are buried so deeply that they move unseen, shaping behavior without awareness and producing harm that feels inevitable. The most dangerous sign in a person, then, is not the presence of anger, envy, fear, or selfishness, because these are simply parts of being human. The most dangerous sign is denial, the insistence on purity, the certainty of innocence, the inability to reflect on one's own flaws. Denial leaves us blind, and blindness leaves the unconscious free to direct our lives. Jung's warning was not that people are doomed by their flaws, but that they are doomed if they pretend they have none. This perspective changes the way we look at ourselves and others. It reminds us that danger is not confined to dramatic figures from history or to villains in stories. It is present in ordinary people, in friends who cannot admit jealousy, in partners who cannot admit dishonesty, in leaders who cannot admit pride, in parents who cannot admit impatience. The harm is not in the flaw itself, but in the refusal to name it. When someone insists that they are incapable of a trait, when they defend their innocence with absolute certainty, when they turn every criticism outward and never inward, these are the warning signs that the shadow has taken control. At the same time, Jung's work offers hope. If denial is the most dangerous sign, then acknowledgement is the most hopeful one. To say, I am not only kind, but also capable of cruelty. I am not only honest, but also capable of dishonesty. I am not only generous, but also capable of selfishness, may feel uncomfortable, but it opens the door to growth. The moment we admit the shadow, it begins to lose its power. The anger that was once expressed unconsciously can now be managed. The envy that distorted relationships can now be understood. The selfishness that was denied can now be balanced with generosity. The flaw itself does not disappear, but awareness transforms it from a blind force into a conscious choice. In this sense, Jung was not only describing a psychological theory, but offering a path toward wholeness. Individuation, his word for the lifelong journey of becoming whole, requires that we face the shadow and integrate it into our sense of self. Wholeness is not purity, because purity is a fragile illusion. Wholeness is balance, the acceptance that light and dark coexist within us. This acceptance does not make us perfect, but it makes us more real, and reality is safer than denial. The closing reflection also invites us to reconsider how we look at others. If we understand that everyone has a shadow, then we can meet others with more patience. When we see arrogance, we can ask whether it hides fear. When we see cruelty, we can ask whether it hides shame. When we see dishonesty, we can ask whether it hides vulnerability. This does not excuse harmful behavior, but it helps us recognize that it often comes from denied parts of the self. With this understanding, we can respond not only with judgment, but also with awareness, and sometimes with compassion. Jung's insight is equally relevant at the collective level. When a community insists that it is uniquely virtuous, we should be cautious. When a nation insists on its innocence, we should look for its shadow. History shows that the greatest harm is often committed not by those who admitted their flaws, but by those who denied them most loudly. Wars, persecutions, and atrocities were justified by illusions of purity. The collective shadow is no different from the individual one. Denied, it creates destruction. Acknowledged, it opens the possibility of change. The closing reflection, then, is both a warning and an invitation. The warning is that denial is the most dangerous sign because it leaves the unconscious in control. The invitation is that awareness can transform the shadow into something less destructive and even constructive. The shadow will never vanish because it is part of us, but it can be integrated. Integration is not a single act, but a lifelong practice of honesty, humility, and patience. In daily life, this means paying attention to moments of irritation, projection, or repetition. It means asking, why does this person disturb me so much? What part of myself am I refusing to see? It means noticing when we defend our innocence too strongly, when we insist that we are never jealous, never angry, never selfish. It means pausing to admit that these traits live within us, and that admitting them makes us safer, not weaker. Jung's closing message is not one of despair, but of realism. The shadow is not a monster that must be destroyed, but a companion that must be acknowledged. Its presence is not a flaw in human nature, but a reminder of our complexity. The danger lies in denial, but the hope lies in awareness. To see the shadow is to reclaim the parts of ourselves we had lost, to take responsibility for the harm we might cause, and to live more consciously. So as we finish this exploration, we return to the question that began it. What is the most dangerous sign in a person? The answer is clear now. It is not anger, or envy, or pride, because these can be recognized and managed. It is denial. It is the refusal to admit what we are capable of. It is the insistence on purity that blinds us to our own complexity. This is the sign that the shadow has taken control. And this is the danger that Jung warned against. But alongside the danger, there is possibility. If denial is the sign of danger, acknowledgement is the sign of growth. If blindness is the problem, awareness is the beginning of freedom. The unconscious will direct our lives until we make it conscious. To make it conscious is to step out of fate and into responsibility. This is the path Jung left for us. And though it is difficult, it is also the path that leads us to live more honestly, more humbly, and more fully as human beings.